She had been his wife for exactly 6 months when she first heard him laugh. It was a deep, warm sound she had never heard in his presence, and it belonged to another woman. The sound drifted through the open doors of the ballroom at Kestrel Manor, where Evelina stood holding a glass of champagne that had long since gone warm in her trembling hand. Her husband, Alexander Montclair, Duke of Kestrel, was standing in the moonlit garden with Lady Constance Whitmore. Their heads were bent close together, silhouettes against the silver light. And then Lady Constance said something, her gloved hand resting lightly on his sleeve, and the Duke of Kestrel laughed. Evelina's stomach dropped into a cold, hollow pit. She had spent half a year tiptoeing through this marriage, speaking softly, dressing carefully, hopping for one soft look from those gray eyes. She had never once drawn a laugh from him, not even a smile. And here, under the stars, he gave that precious sound to a woman who was not his wife. Behind her, the low murmur of the guests buzzed like flies. Evelina could feel their glances crawling across the back of her neck. She was the new Duchess, the Baron's daughter who had been handed over in a swift, quiet ceremony 6 months earlier. Everyone knew the marriage had been arranged quickly, coolly. No one knew why, but the whispers were already blooming. He cannot stand to be in the same room with her, someone had said just last week, thinking she was out of earshot. And now, the garden scene would feed those whispers for months. Evelina set her glass down on a passing tray and walked towards the terrace doors as calmly as she could manage. Her heart was beating so hard she felt it in her throat. She did not go outside to interrupt them. She did not demand an explanation. She simply stood at the threshold, half hidden by the heavy velvet curtain, and watched her husband's cold, beautiful face soften into something she had never been allowed to see. That was the first night Evelina understood that she had been waiting for a love that would never come. The days that followed were quiet and gray, much like the English autumn settling over the countryside. Kestrel Manor was a grand, sprawling estate of pale stone and dark timber, surrounded by ancient woodlands that turned copper and gold with the season. It should have felt like a fairy tale. Instead, it felt like a beautiful cage. Alexander was rarely home. When he was, he spent his hours in the library or riding out across the fields, always with some excuse, some business, some boundary she could not cross. Evelina wandered the long corridors alone, her slippers making no sound on the thick carpets. She learned the names of the servants because no one else would speak with her. She took tea by herself in the morning room, the vast table set for one. She wrote letters to her younger sister that she never sent, because what could she say? That her husband looked through her as if she were made of glass. That she had begun to dread the sound of his footsteps, not because she feared him, but because she feared the silence he brought with him. Still, a stubborn spark of hope refused to die. She had been raised to believe that duty could grow into affection, that patience and gentleness could win even the coldest heart. So she tried. She made certain his favorite meals were prepared. She placed fresh flowers in the library. She wore the pale blue gown his housekeeper mentioned he had once admired on a painting of some long-dead ancestor. She sat in the drawing room each evening, waiting for him to come through the door. Some nights he did. Most nights he did not. And on the nights he did appear, he would nod, exchange a handful of empty words, and then retreat behind his study door, leaving her with nothing but the echo of his footsteps. One evening in late October, Evelina gathered her courage and followed him to the study. She had a tray of tea, a plate of biscuits she had helped the cook bake herself. It felt like a small, foolish offering, but it was all she had. She knocked softly. There was a pause. Then his voice, low and clipped, "Enter." Alexander was seated behind a massive oak desk, papers spread before him. The firelight caught the hard planes of his face, the stern line of his jaw. He did not look up. "I brought you tea," she said. Her voice sounded too thin, too hopeful. He glanced at the tray, then at her, and something flickered in his gaze. It was not warmth. It was more like inconvenience. "You need not trouble yourself, Evelina. The servants can attend to such things." "I wanted to," she said, setting the tray on the corner of the desk. "I thought perhaps we could speak for a moment." His quill paused. He finally lifted his eyes fully to her face. They were beautiful eyes, pale gray like winter sky and utterly unreadable. "Is something troubling you? Are you unwell? Has a bill gone unpaid?" The questions landed like small, cold stones. He thought she was there to complain about money or health. He did not consider, not even for a heartbeat, that she might simply want his company. Evelina pressed her lips together and shook her head. "No, nothing of that sort. I only thought we might get to know one another a little." A muscle tightened along his jaw. He looked down at his papers again. "This is a marriage of duty, Evelina. I never promised you anything beyond my name and my protection. I have given both. I suggest you find your contentment in that." She stood there, the tray between them, the steam curling up from the teapot like a departing ghost. She wanted to say 100 things. She wanted to ask why he had married her at all if he felt nothing. She wanted to cry. She wanted to run. She did none of those things. She simply nodded, her chin held high, and walked out of the study with slow, measured steps. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, the first tear slid down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, angrily, but more followed. She hurried to her chambers, shut the door, and pressed her forehead against the cool wood. Her chest ached with a pain so sharp it stole her breath. She had been waiting for love, but there was nothing to wait for. There never had been. The turning point arrived 3 weeks later, wrapped not in anger but in a quiet, devastating truth she was never meant to hear. Evelina had been suffering from a mild headache and had gone to the far end of the manor, to the little-used east corridor, hoping to walk it off in peace. The corridor ended in a small sitting room, rarely opened. As she approached, she heard voices through the partly open door. One was Alexander's. The other belonged to Mr. Farrow, his solicitor, a thin man with a nervous habit of clicking his pen. Evelina knew she should turn away. Eavesdropping was beneath her, but something in the strained tone of her husband's voice pinned her feet to the floor. "The terms are settled, then," Alexander was saying. His voice was heavy, drained. "The full inheritance is now irrevocably mine." "Indeed, Your Grace," Mr. Farrow replied. "Your late uncle's condition was most particular. Marry a woman of noble birth before your 30th birthday, and remain married for at least 1 year. Once that year is complete, the fortune is yours without restriction. The marriage must appear authentic, of course, but the legal requirement will be satisfied in a few short months." There was a long pause. Evelina's blood slowed until she felt it might stop altogether. "Appear authentic," Alexander repeated almost to himself. "Yes, the late Duke wanted to ensure you established a proper household. He feared you would remain a bachelor and let the bloodline dwindle. An eccentric old man, but his wishes were ironclad. Fortunately, Lady Evelina has played her role with grace. Quiet, unassuming. She has caused no trouble. A few more months and the matter is concluded." The words sank into Evelina's heart like shards of ice. She was not a wife. She was a transaction, a necessary piece of parchment in a legal arrangement. Her husband had married her to claim a fortune, and she had been chosen precisely because she was quiet, because she would not make demands, because she was biddable and unremarkable and so easy to ignore. She did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked back down the corridor, her knees threatening to buckle with every step. She did not cry this time. Her heart had simply closed, a great iron gate slamming shut in her chest. That night, she sat before the mirror in her room and looked at her own reflection for a long time. She saw a woman who had twisted herself into knots trying to be loved, who had poured out patience like water into sand. She saw a woman who had been invisible not because she lacked worth, but because she had been giving her worth to a man who had never asked for it. Something inside her shifted. It was not anger. It was a quiet, steely resolve. If she was to be only a name on a legal document, then she would stop waiting for more. She would stop waiting for him to turn around. She would stop waiting for love. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin living for herself. The change was not dramatic. It did not arrive with slammed doors or tearful accusations. It came in small, nearly imperceptible steps that, over the following weeks, gathered into a quiet revolution. Evelina no longer placed flowers in the library. She no longer lingered in the drawing room in the evening, hopping for her husband's footsteps. She no longer dressed in colors she thought he might favor. Instead, she chose gowns she liked, soft grays and deep greens that made her own eyes look brighter. She took long walks through the estate gardens, bundled in a thick cloak, and learned the names of every gardener and stable hand. She sat in the kitchen sometimes, drinking tea with the cook and laughing at stories of village mischief. The staff, who had once treated her with distant formality, began to warm to her. They saw a new lightness in her step. And she began visiting the village. Kestrel village lay just beyond the estate gates, a cluster of stone cottages and narrow lanes. Evelina had driven through it a few times in the ducal carriage, but she had never truly seen it. Now she went alone, walking beside hedgerows dusted with frost, her maid trailing behind in a state of mild bewilderment. The villagers were poor but proud. Many were struggling as winter approached. She saw children with bare feet and hollow cheeks. She saw elderly folk huddled in doorways. It stirred something fierce in her chest. She began bringing baskets of food, then blankets, then medicine she quietly purchased with her own modest allowance. She did not announce these actions. She simply did them, moving through the lanes like a quiet, determined ghost, learning names, pressing coins into trembling hands, sitting with a sickly widow named Mrs. Pemberton, and listening to her stories until the woman's eyes grew bright with comfort. It was during one of these visits that she first met Dr. Marcus Gray. He was a young physician, newly arrived in the county, with kind brown eyes and a gentle manner that instantly put people at ease. He had heard of the Duchess's quiet charity and sought her out one afternoon as she was leaving the apothecary. "Your Grace," he said, bowing with a warmth that felt genuine rather than flattering. "Forgive my forwardness, but I wanted to thank you. The medicines you supplied to the Thorne family saved little Eliza's life. I am Dr. Gray, the parish physician." Evelina felt a flush creep up her cheeks. She was not accustomed to being thanked. "It was nothing, Dr. Gray. I only did what anyone would do." He smiled, and it was a smile that reached his eyes. "You would be surprised how many people do nothing, but I suspect you are not the sort of person who can turn away from suffering." Those words landed somewhere deep inside her, a place that had been starved for recognition. She found herself smiling back, a real smile, the first unguarded smile she had worn in a very long time. "The village has been kind to me. It is only right." Dr. Gray tipped his hat, and from that day forward he became a quiet ally. He would meet her occasionally on her rounds, sharing news of patients, suggesting where help was most needed. He never overstepped. He simply treated her as a capable, intelligent woman, not as an extension of a duke's title. And that, to Evelina, felt like sunlight after a long winter. Word of the Duchess's village work eventually filtered back to Kestrel Manor. The servants spoke of it with a new kind of respect. Even the estate steward mentioned it to the Duke in passing, noting how the villagers' loyalty to the family had strengthened. Alexander listened, his gray eyes unreadable, and said nothing. But he began to notice things. He noticed that the morning room, which had always seemed to hold a faint, expectant tension, now felt emptier. He noticed that his wife no longer waited for him in the evening. He noticed that the flowers in the library had stopped appearing, and for some reason, their absence unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He noticed that her laughter, which he had rarely ever heard, now sometimes drifted up from the kitchens or the garden, always when he was not there. It was a strange, creeping thing, this awareness. It tugged at the edges of his thoughts when he sat alone in his study. It made him look up when a door opened, only to feel a sharp pinch of disappointment when it was a servant and not his wife. One evening he came home earlier than usual. The house was quiet. He walked through the drawing room, the morning room, the gallery, and found them all empty. Finally, he climbed the stairs and approached the door to his wife's chambers. It was slightly ajar. He could hear a soft, musical sound inside. She was humming a gentle, off-tune melody, and the sound of it stopped him in his tracks. There was something so contented, so self-contained about it, that he felt like an intruder. He had never heard her hum before. He had never given her a reason to. He stood there for a long moment, his hand half raised to knock and then lowered it. He did not know what to say. The words he had always used, cool, polite, distant, felt like the wrong language entirely. He turned and walked away, a strange, hollow ache pressing against his ribs. That ache grew sharper the following week when he attended a village harvest assembly, an event his steward had convinced him would improve relations with the tenants. He went reluctantly, expecting tedious speeches and stale cider. Instead, the first thing he saw upon entering the village hall was his wife, seated at a long bench, surrounded by laughing children. She had a little girl on her lap, and she was helping the child weave a crown of dried flowers. Her face was lit with a joy he had never seen, not once, in all the months of their marriage. And beside her, leaning down to speak quietly into her ear, was a man Alexander did not know. A tall man, young, with a physician's bag slung over his shoulder and an expression of frank admiration on his face. The man said something, and Evelina laughed. It was not a polite, guarded laugh. It was genuine, warm, and utterly unguarded. The same kind of laugh Alexander had given to Lady Constance in the garden, but sweeter, truer. Something hot and unfamiliar twisted in Alexander's gut. It took him a moment to recognize it. Jealousy. Sharp, bitter, and entirely unexpected. He had no right to feel it. He had ignored this woman for months. He had married her for a fortune. He had treated her like a piece of furniture. And yet, seeing her light up for another man made his hands curl into fists at his sides. He strode into the hall and the room quieted. Villagers bowed and curtsied. Evelina looked up, and for an instant her eyes met his. He expected to see nervousness or perhaps a flicker of the old longing. Instead, her gaze was calm, polite, and utterly unbothered. She gave him a small nod, as one might give a passing acquaintance, and then returned her attention to the child on her lap. The dismissal was so complete that Alexander felt physically winded. He spent the rest of the assembly standing stiffly at the edge of the room, watching his wife charm everyone around her, while the village physician hovered nearby like a devoted shadow. When Dr. Gray helped Evelina adjust the flower crown on the little girl's head, and their fingers brushed, Alexander's vision narrowed until all he could see was that brief, innocent contact. That night he lay awake for hours. The memory of her laughter, not for him, played over and over in his mind. He began to understand with a slow, creeping dread that he had made a catastrophic mistake. He had pushed her away so completely that she had stopped needing him, and the worst part was he could not even blame her. The emotional distance between them widened into a chasm in the days that followed. Evelina no longer went out of her way to avoid him, but she treated him with a serene, impenetrable courtesy that was somehow more painful than tears. She would ask after his day as if inquiring about the weather. She would pass him the salt at dinner with a smile that never reached her eyes. She had become a stranger wearing his ring. And then, one bitter afternoon, the distance was shattered by a moment of public humiliation that brought everything crashing to the surface. A grand luncheon was held at Kestrel Manor for the neighboring gentry. It was an event Evelina had been dreading, but she performed her duties with quiet dignity, greeting guests, and managing the household arrangements with a competence that surprised everyone, including herself. Lady Constance Whitmore was there, of course, draped in crimson silk and dripping with pearls. She had positioned herself close to the Duke from the moment she arrived, her laugh trilling through the rooms like a bird call. Halfway through the afternoon, as the guests gathered in the conservatory for tea, Lady Constance's voice cut through the chatter with deliberate clarity. "Oh, dear Duchess, I must ask you about the village children. I hear you've taken quite the interest in them. How quaint. Do you find them a suitable substitute for a family of your own?" The room fell silent. The implication was cruelly clear. You have no children, you have no husband's love, so you fill the void with peasant charity. Evelina felt the heat of dozens of curious, pitying stares. Her heart hammered, but she lifted her chin. She had endured worse. She had endured 6 months of emptiness in this very house. Before she could respond, Alexander spoke. His voice cut across the room, cold and sharp as a blade. Lady Constance, my wife's charitable work is a credit to this house. I will not have it mocked under my roof. If you cannot speak with respect, I suggest you hold your tongue. The silence turned electric. Lady Constance's face went pale, then flushed a deep, ugly red. She sputtered something unintelligible and retreated to the far side of the room. The guests exchanged startled glances. The Duke of Kestrel, who was known for his cold reserve, had just publicly defended his wife with unmistakable force. Evelina stood frozen, her teacup trembling slightly in her hand. She did not feel triumphant. She felt confused, and beneath that a flicker of something dangerous. It would have been so easy to let that moment soften her heart, to hope again. But she had learned that hope was a blade that cut only the one who held it. She looked at Alexander, and for a long moment their eyes held. There was something in his gaze she had never seen before. It looked almost like desperation. But she was too tired, too guarded to decipher it. She simply inclined her head in a silent thank you and turned back to her guests, her walls firmly in place. That evening, as dusk fell, Alexander found her in the small rose garden at the back of the manor. It was her favorite spot, the only place where she allowed herself to feel something other than numb. He approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. She did not turn around. "Evelina," he said, and his voice was rougher than usual, as if he had been running or had not spoken in hours. "May I have a word?" She turned then, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "Of course, Your Grace." The formal title landed like a slap. He flinched. "I wanted to apologize for what happened today. Lady Constance was disgraceful." "It is no matter," Evelina said. "I have grown accustomed to Lady Constance's barbs, and I thank you for your defense. It was kind." Kind? The word was so small, so insufficient that it made his chest ache. He took a step closer. "It was not kindness, it was the truth. I will not allow anyone to speak ill of you." She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said, very quietly, "Why does it matter to you, Alexander? You have never cared before." The question hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth, but no words came, because the answer was too vast, too tangled, too shameful, because I was blind, because I am a fool, because I am only now beginning to see what I have thrown away. He could not say any of that. The words lodged in his throat like stones. Seeing his silence, Evelina gave a small, sad smile. "I thought so. Good night, Your Grace." She walked past him, the hem of her gown brushing the gravel, and disappeared into the house. Alexander stood alone in the rose garden, the scent of dying petals around him, and felt the full, crushing weight of his own cowardice. The emotional climax began to build not in a grand gesture, but in the quiet, terrifying vulnerability of illness. It started as a chill. Evelina had spent the better part of a week in the village, helping the Thorne family whose youngest had fallen ill with a fever. She ignored her own fatigue, returning each evening to the manor paler and more drawn, until one morning she simply could not rise from her bed. Her maid found her burning with fever, her skin clammy and her breath shallow. Word spread through the manor like wildfire. The physician was summoned. Dr. Gray, his face tight with worry, examined her for a long time and then stepped into the hallway where Alexander was packing like a caged animal. "The fever is severe, Your Grace," Dr. Gray said, his voice low and strained. "I have done all I can for now, but she is very weak. There is something else you must know." He paused, and his eyes held a somber light. "Her Grace is with child. The illness makes it a dangerous situation for both mother and baby." The world tilted around Alexander. He gripped the doorframe to steady himself. A child. Their child. A life he had never thought to create, a future he had never allowed himself to imagine, and now he might lose both of them. The realization flooded him with a terror so absolute it nearly drove him to his knees. He did not leave her side for 3 days. He sat in a chair drawn close to the bed, watching her shallow breathing, pressing cool cloths to her forehead with hands that trembled. He spoke to her in a low, broken murmur, though she was too delirious to hear. He told her things he had never dared to say aloud. He told her about the inheritance condition, the desperate, shameful arrangement that had trapped them both. He told her he had chosen her because she seemed gentle and undemanding, and he had been too much of a coward to let anyone close. He told her he had spent months watching her from a distance, seeing the light in her die a little more each day, and doing nothing. He told her that the day he saw her laughing in the village hall, his heart had cracked open, and everything he had locked inside had come spilling out, too late. "I love you," he whispered, his forehead pressed to her fevered hand. "I love you too late, and I know I do not deserve your forgiveness. But please, Evelina, please stay. I cannot lose you, I cannot." On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Evelina opened her eyes to pale winter sunlight and the sight of her husband slumped in a chair beside her, his clothes rumpled, his face hollow with exhaustion. He looked like a man who had walked through fire. She was too weak to speak, but she managed to move her fingers just enough to brush against his hand. His eyes flew open instantly. "Evelina," he breathed. The word was a prayer, a plea, a promise all at once. Over the following weeks, the manor became a place of slow, tentative healing. Evelina's strength returned in fragile increments, and with it came the heavy, necessary conversations they had both been avoiding. One evening, when she was well enough to sit by the fire in her sitting room, Alexander came to her. He knelt before her, something no Duke of Kestrel had likely done in generations, and took her hands in his. "I need to tell you the truth," he said, his voice raw. "All of it. And then, if you choose to leave me, I will not stop you. I will provide for you, for the child, anything you need. You deserve so much more than the way I have treated you." And so he told her about the inheritance, the condition, the arrangement he had made with her father. He told her that he had seen the marriage as a cold transaction, and that he had kept himself distant out of fear and pride, and a dozen other excuses that now seemed pathetically small. He told her that he had been a fool, a blind, arrogant fool, and that she, in her quiet strength, had shown him more grace than he had any right to receive. Evelina listened without interruption. When he finished, silence settled between them like a held breath. Then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I already knew," she said. "I overheard you with Mr. Farrow months ago. That was the day I stopped hopping for your love." The confession hit Alexander like a fist to the chest. He stared at her, horrified. "You knew. All this time you knew, and you stayed." "I stayed because I had nowhere else to go," she said, and the honesty in her voice was not cruel, only truthful. "I stayed because I decided to build a life for myself, within the cage I had been given. And that life, the village, the children, Dr. Gray's friendship, it saved me." The name Dr. Gray made Alexander's jaw tighten, but he forced himself to hold his tongue. He had no right to jealousy. He had earned his place as a stranger in her heart. "But something else changed," Evelina continued, her eyes meeting his with a clarity that took his breath away. "When I was ill, I heard you. I don't know what was fever dream and what was real, but I heard your voice. I heard you say you loved me. Was that real, Alexander? Or was it only my imagination?" He reached up and cupped her face with a gentleness that surprised them both. "It was real, every word. I love you, Evelina. I have loved you for longer than I knew how to admit. I was terrified of love, terrified of losing control, and I took that fear out on you. I am so sorry. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you if you will let me." Tears slipped down her cheeks, silent and shimmering. She did not pull away. She placed her hand over his, holding it against her skin. "I am not the same woman who married you. That woman was desperate for scraps of affection. I will not live on scraps again. If we are to be a true husband and wife, then I need a true partner, not a master, not a distant stranger who occasionally protects me from rude guests. I need someone who sees me. I see you, he said, his voice breaking. I see you, Evelina. I see the woman who brought warmth to a cold house. I see the woman who fed the hungry and comforted the sick. I see the mother of my child, the keeper of my heart. I see you, and I am so deeply, terrifyingly in love with you that I do not know how I survived being apart from you. She studied his face for a long, aching moment. Then, very slowly, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. Then we will learn, she whispered, together. The rest of the winter passed in a haze of quiet, precious moments. Alexander courted his wife with a clumsiness that was utterly endearing. He brought her tea himself, forgetting the sugar until she laughed and reminded him. He walked with her in the garden, holding her elbow as if she were made of spun glass. He sat through her stories of the villagers without a trace of impatience, and he even donated a substantial sum to build a small schoolhouse, a project Evelina had long dreamed of but never dared ask for. When Dr. Gray came to check on her health, Alexander thanked him with a sincerity that surprised them both, and Dr. Gray, a man of enormous decency, simply smiled and said, "Take care of her, Your Grace. She is the best person in this county, and I will hold you to that." There were still moments of awkwardness, shadows of the old pain that could not vanish overnight, but they spoke now, really spoke. Late into the night, they would sit by the fire in his study, a room she had once been barred from entering, and unravel the tangled threads of their past. She told him about the months of loneliness, the nights spent crying into her pillow. He told her about his own cold upbringing, the uncle who had instilled in him a terror of emotion, the armor he had built around his heart that had nearly suffocated him. They wept together, more than once. And then they held each other, and the tears became something cleansing. Spring arrived with a riot of green and the sound of birdsong. On a soft April morning, Evelina gave birth to a daughter, a tiny, perfect girl with her father's gray eyes and her mother's gentle mouth. The birth was difficult, but she came through it, and when Alexander held his child for the first time, the great, cold Duke of Kestrel wept openly, unashamed. He named the baby Elinor after Evelina's mother. He stood before the household, the servants gathered in the great hall, and he made a declaration that would be talked about in the county for years. "This child," he said, his voice ringing with emotion, "is the greatest gift I have ever received, second only to the love of her mother. And I swear before you all, I will be a better father than I was a husband in those first, dark months. I will earn my place in this family every single day." Evelina, watching from a chair draped in blankets with the baby in her arms, felt a smile bloom on her face. It was not the guarded, polite smile of months past. It was the real thing, the kind that reached the eyes and stayed there. The healing took time. It always does. But it rooted deep and grew strong. The schoolhouse was built, and Evelina, now stronger and more confident than she had ever been, oversaw its establishment with a passion that drew admiration from all quarters. Alexander supported her, not with distant patronage but with his own hands, helping to lay the foundation stones and reading to the children on winter afternoons. The villagers came to love the strange, once-old Duke who had transformed into a man, who carried his daughter on his shoulders through the meadow, and walked hand in hand with his wife along the village lanes. One evening, as the sun set over Kestrel Manor in a blaze of gold and rose, Evelina stood on the terrace where she had once watched her husband laugh with another woman. This time, Alexander stood beside her, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. Little Elinor was asleep in the nursery. The air smelled of honeysuckle and fresh earth. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked, his lips brushing her temple. "I was thinking about that ball," she said. "The night I heard you laugh in the garden, I thought my heart would shatter." He closed his eyes, pain flickering across his features. "I am so sorry." She turned in his arms and looked up at him. "Don't be. That was the beginning of the end of my waiting. It broke me, but it also freed me. And then you came and found me in the broken pieces." He traced the line of her jaw with a thumb. "I will spend every day finding you, Evelina. Even when you are right beside me, I will keep finding you." She rose on her toes and kissed him, a soft, slow kiss that tasted of forgiveness and new beginnings and the steady, certain warmth of a love that had been tested and proven true. The stars came out above them, and the manor behind them glowed with candlelight, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Evelina felt no shadows, only light. And so the Duchess of Kestrel, who had once stopped waiting for love, discovered that love had been waiting for her all along. It had simply needed the courage to grow. In the end, it was not a fairy tale of instant passion. It was a story of two people who learned to see each other, truly see each other, and in that seeing built something unbreakable. The silence of the old days was replaced with laughter, the cold distance with a closeness that deepened with each passing season. And when the village children ran through the garden paths, and the young Duchess taught them to read under the oak tree, and the Duke watched from his study window with a heart so full it ached, the world felt, for a moment, exactly as it should be. A place where even the most carefully guarded hearts could find their way home.